right, everybody. Thanks again for coming along today, and you have to put up with me for the next little bit. But I probably won't be the full hour anyway. We'll see how we get on with it anyway. But so going to look today at why we would teach the book of Proverbs. It's maybe not the first book you might think of if you were coming to teach a certain section of the Bible. It's maybe one of the dustier parts of your Bible, and up until earlier this year, it was one that I hadn't really studied in depth, if I'm honest, for a long time. But I've been teaching a little bit through it this year in a few different contexts, of which I'll explain. So there's a number of different ways you can go about teaching the book. So we'll do that, and we'll get stuck into it. So Proverbs is really about the know-how to tackle everyday life. That is I think the key thrust of the book, is that it's not just a dusty old book about wise sayings or about poetry or anything like that. It's actually immensely practical, and it's something that every single person can learn a lot out of. And I think as we'll go through the session today, we'll see that. And it's about, when you do come to teach Proverbs, it's about driving that home to your audience, is that everyone can learn a lot from this book. It's not just for wise people or for learned people or some lofty ideal of wisdom. It's really about the nitty-gritty, everyday things of life and how to apply wisdom in so many scenarios. So that's one of the big things about the book. So, question to ask, are we wise guys? You might think of wise guys and you might think of New York mobsters who are known as that. Maybe that looks a bit like the Crescent welcoming group on a Sunday morning. I don't know, maybe that's what greets you as you come through the door. But not thinking of it so much in the sort of the Goodfellas, New York mobster wise guy sort of thing. Are we wise? Are we wise people? Are we wise men? And so much of it is a challenge to us, I think, as we come to teach the book. Is first of all, is that wisdom found in us as we read through the book? Does this resonate as with me as someone that is wise? And I think we need to be challenged by that and make sure that we're living our lives in accordance with what Proverbs is saying about wisdom before we come to teach it to anyone else. But that's really what we want to get from teaching this book, is that our audience become wiser as a result. And we'll explain what we mean by that as we go along. So why would you teach Proverbs? Well, linking it back to another verse which I found helpful when looking at Proverbs is Psalm 90:12. Teach us to number our days so that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom. So Proverbs isn't just so much about learning wisdom, it's about applying your heart unto wisdom, putting that into practice in your life. And we all have to apply our hearts unto wisdom. There's many examples. I'm sure we can all think of maybe knowledgeable Christians, and of course you need to learn the Bible. You need to study it. Of course, that's so true. But it's not all that much use if we're not actually putting that into everyday life. And you can know all about the scriptures, you can quote chapter and verse, and you can know the books inside out, but unless you're actually applying the wisdom that's found in it, and especially the wisdom that's found in Proverbs, it's not really that much use to everyday life. So we actually have to apply our hearts and our lives onto wisdom. And it's for everyday living, as I've said. It applies to you, of course. It applies to every member of your audience. So yes, there's going to be different facets of your audience. We covered that in our session before, just with the preach-off. There's going to be different people in your audience that you're trying to speak to. There's going to be young people, there's going to be old people, there's going to be people from all different walks of life. But there is things from within this book that are applicable to every single person. There's so many vast topics that are explored in that. So with all that being said, how then do we actually teach it? How would you then start to then teach that to an audience in a church, either it's your own church or somewhere else that you're visiting to speak? So the key to the book is really this phrase here, the fear of the Lord, or reverence for God. So any teaching And the book of Proverbs needs to be grounded on this following central theme: fear of the Lord, or reverence. So we can see that fear really means reverence, and I'm sure we're all quite familiar with that. We don't obviously mean, when we're talking about fear of the God, we're actually scared of him. We're not meaning that. But of course we need to have respect and reverence for God in our lives if we're ever to show any sense of wisdom. And that's a really useful way to look at the book when you're actually looking at the practical, what actually happened with Solomon. Solomon, of course, is the writer for much of the book of Proverbs, but Solomon actually isn't the best example of wisdom. You might think people refer to Solomon as a wise king, and he was that to a certain degree, but he also didn't live very well, especially towards the end of his life, and we'll come to that shortly. So Solomon had wisdom, but he lost that real fear, that reverence for God, and God just didn't have the right place in his life, certainly towards the end of it. So you can see that on this chart on the right-hand side, that fear of the Lord, or reverence, runs right throughout the book. It's the common strand, it's the common theme that just runs the whole way right throughout the book. So you have at the start, 1 verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. It appears multiple times. It appears in the middle. 15:33, the fear of the Lord is the instruction for wisdom. And then at the end of the book, you have a woman referred to specifically, a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. So that is essentially the key to wisdom. That's where it begins and ends with, is fear or reverence for the Lord. So we're going to do one last practical session today, just to get our brains into gear again as we study this. So this is the assignment. You're assigned Proverbs chapter 25, verses 1 to 14 to teach. So some church somewhere is crazy enough to give you this random passage in Proverbs to teach, and you are racking your brains to think, how do I begin to teach this? So there's a couple of assumptions that we're going to make, first of all, before we launch into this. You've done a bit of reading with the book, you've sat down like our first session, and you've maybe looked at a few commentaries, you've read through the book, and you're a bit familiar with it, and you've discovered that the book centers around wisdom, and that the key to knowing this is the fear of the Lord. So then how do you begin to teach that to a church? Bearing in mind, you want to make it practical. You want your audience to be challenged by it. You want them to take things away from this. And one of the things to think about then is who is this section written for? Who in the church, as you're speaking, can benefit from that? Maybe one thing that you want to circle in your mind as a bit of a hint is leaders. Is there something that maybe leaders in different walks of life can take away from that? So if you want to do that for maybe take a few minutes just to read this section, and then maybe about 5 minutes to discuss it. So maybe about 10 minutes in total between your groups, and just look through the different verses in this section and think of some of the key themes that emerge from this, and maybe how you would then go about teaching this specific passage to a church. Okay, I think we'll maybe leave it there just for the sake of time. If we want to move back into our positions. Okay. We start with this side of the room. Is there any key themes that you thought you would bring out of this if you were assigned to teach this? How would you go about doing that?
We initially tried to see if there was connections between all of it, and we don't really know if there was. It seemed to be starting with kings and government and this kind of thing, and then move into court, which obviously would have been very connected in those days. That's where the main court was, the presence of the king, and then go into speech a bit more. But that we didn't even know if we should be doing that. Should be trying to see how this all flows or not, but that's what we did.
Okay.
And that was what we came up with. Yeah.
Good. Anything else from the table at the back, or anything you want to add, or I'll agree with that?
Well, we thought they were connected.
Uh-huh.
The 5 things which anybody in management, maybe who's running a business or a government department, issues that they would be faced with. There are things that the boss can't tell everybody else about the future plans and so on, so concealing things. The people that you employ, the officials, the success of your venture depends crucially on your officials who you work with, so you've got to get rid of corruption. Be careful who you appoint. Being promoted, verses 6 and 7. Some people will be very pushy, and you just got to be careful about people like that. About 9 and 10, and even 11 and 12 are about disputes, going to court, getting rulings, getting judgment. It's better to get wise conflict resolution rather than going through the official court. So getting good advice is a good way. So conflict always happens in a business and in employment, and being able, a good king, if you like, will be able to resolve that. And then 13, 14 and 15 was it?
Communication.
About communication. Who tells you the truth? If you want to know what's going on in your business, who do you listen to? Often you get very different pictures, and you need a trustworthy witness.
Thank you very much. So that's actually a really original take on it, actually, like you said earlier. I think that's a brilliant take. I hadn't thought about the passage from the perspective of leadership so much in the workplace, and I think you could absolutely use that. Maybe it might not necessarily be teaching that you would deliver on a Sunday morning to a whole church, but maybe it's a session that you have with men, like Christians in leadership or something. You could absolutely take. I think that would be very, very useful. I think a lot of the tables, as myself, would looked at it maybe from leadership in the church, in the context of the church and amongst other Christians per se, maybe the secular employment side of it. But that's a very useful way to look at it too. Was there anything in the other side of the room that anyone wants to add to that, or any thoughts about how you would tackle that?
We kind of talked about, and this is the case with any kind of sermon prep, but maybe more so in Proverbs, you can't really limit what you talk about to what is written just on the page.
Yeah. Because
it's written in a poetic manner, it's kind of designed to make you think about the actual, the applicable teaching that it's talking about, and then your task is to expand on that. So,
yep.
If you're talking about interpersonal relationships within the church and wisdom and giving advice, that kind of thing, you're going to draw a lot more from possibly other parts of scripture than you are. This is more of like a launch pad for thinking about that kind of thing. There's not a lot of necessarily theological depth here, but it's a very good.
I think absolutely you have to do that. If you were assigned this or you were choose to teach it, you have to expand on it a little bit more. You have to use maybe a little bit of license with it, because obviously you're not really going to be speaking to kings necessarily, like literal kings, but you have to then employ some of the what underpins this. What's the key themes that are coming out of that? Anything else before we leave it? All good. We'll move on, sure, for the sake of time. But yeah, some of the key themes that are coming out of this is the context of the Proverbs of Solomon. In this section, they're Hezekiah's men that really restore this section of it. It was written by Solomon, but it was really discovered about 200 years later. And these men of Hezekiah, they essentially resurrected some of the things to bring revival to Israel. It wasn't in a very good place at that time. A lot of the kings had departed away from following God. They'd gone down their own path. So the idea was really to write it to rulers and how to rule well. These kings weren't doing too good, so they needed to instruct them on how to rule well, what they needed to do. And then from our perspective, how we would then try and teach that, well, it's perhaps relevant for those in leadership and authority. We had thought of elders. I know a lot of the tables had thought about maybe leadership in that sense, about elders, about even maybe preparing people on down the line for that and getting the foundational blocks in place for that. But as Danny's group had said about, you could maybe apply that to and maybe in employment in a secular sphere as well. So there's very useful stuff in that too. So just a bit of a table on some of the themes that I identified from this. There's a lot else you could say on this, but just a suggestion, 2 to 3. You have the role of God and kings compared. God's ways are unsearchable, and leaders require knowledge to govern, so they need knowledge. God doesn't, of course, need any counsel himself, but leaders do. Leaders need counsel, they need guidance, and they should seek it out. They should make it incumbent upon themselves to go and seek out this knowledge from God. They're the ones who are required to lead people. So you move down a little bit, 6 and 7. Humility is a big factor. It's written to king's subjects about humility as a subject, but it's, of course, it's relevant to everyone. It's relevant to kings too. It's relevant to leaders. Any leader in any sphere needs to have a certain degree of humility about them. They can't be proud or boastful or arrogant, and that's going to be relevant for your whole audience. 8 to 10 about restraining the tongue. Be careful what you say. What will you do if you go and you argue with your neighbour and then they end up humiliating you? You're going to be really embarrassed. So just be very careful about what you're saying to people, and of course that's going to be a mark of leadership. A good leader is going to know what to say, when to say it, and of course before anyone ever gets to that position, they're going to need to be someone who employs that and shows that well. And yeah, I think one of the things that came out of our earlier sessions as well, I just was, as I was reading through it in 1 Timothy 3, if anyone does not know how to manage his own family, how can he take care of God's church? So you could maybe build in around husbands. If you had a session with men, you could build around husbands and fathers and the importance of leading at home too, and demonstrating that. And then 11, 12, the importance of a word in the right time. And a good leader knows when to give encouragement, knows the right thing to say, and how that builds it up. And of course, fear of the Lord, reverence, respect for God underpins all of this. If someone doesn't have the right reverence, the right respect for God in their life, none of the rest of this is going to fall into place. So that is the key thing to drive home, I think, underpinning the whole message. So a very difficult passage to try and teach, and hopefully you wouldn't be given that just in isolation, but it could, I suppose, happen. So some suggestions just on how to teach Proverbs, how you might go about it in a church. This is one of the ways that it's been broken up. Is it's divided into a series of 5 classrooms, and you're approaching it from that idea of treating it like a school, like the book's like a bit of a school, and you're working through the classrooms or the prospectus within this school. And then the last one, the 6th one, is really a graduation ceremony. So you work your way through the 5 classrooms, and then you get to the graduation at the end. So the college of choice, as I've called it at the start, chapters 1:7 to 9:18, and then the workshop of wisdom. I'm going to run through these in a few minutes, but 10 verse 1 to 22:16, school of the sages 22:17 to 25:28, and the hall of Hezekiah, which we've just thought of, in 25:29 to 30 verse 23. The words of Agur, who is another wise man, in 30:24 to 31 verse 9. And then at the very end, you have the gallery of virtue, or this graduation ceremony, and that's 31:10, and then right through to the end of the book, just the last few verses of chapter 31. So that's a helpful way to look at it if you are trying to get a bit of division in the book, and trying to create a bit of structure as well with it, is treating it like a series of classrooms that we are trying to get various different strands of instruction from. So some suggestions then as well on how you would actually go about teaching this. You could divide it up into these 6 classrooms. Maybe you're thinking of approaching teaching in your church, and you might think, well, right, we're going to do 5, or we're going to do 5 or 6 sessions on it, and each week we'll break it up into these sessions. We'll do 1 week in classroom 1, second week in classroom 2, and so on. And that's one way to do it. I haven't done it that way. I've given a book overview. So recently I gave a book overview in my own church about Proverbs. It depends, I suppose, on just the way your teaching schedule too is with your church. A book overview is good. You maybe don't get into as much of the detail as is found in the whole book, but at least you're given in one session an overview as to the whole book, and your audience will maybe hopefully leave understanding, yes, this is the flow of the book, I understand that, and you're really trying to prompt them then to go away and to study it themselves and to get stuck into some more of it themselves and explore it that way. Another way that I've looked at it in the past few months is a topical study, and in small groups, and that's been really good. And I've been working through it a few months ago with a group of younger guys, and you might want to pick out some themes that run through the book, and they're not necessarily in certain chapters. You might get chapter 1 speaking about money, you might also get chapter 25 speaking about the same thing. So it might not necessarily be divided up into neatly into different chapters, but you might want to pick out some themes like money, like anger, words, taming the tongue, your attitude to work, about choices, and maybe even raising children. Again, I didn't really cover that with a group of teenage boys necessarily, but it depends maybe on the group that you're leading and you're teaching there. So there's a number of different ways you can look at it, and it's those second two that I've had a bit of experience with, and I found it really, really useful for doing that. So I just want to move through for a few minutes just some of the classrooms that we've looked at, and pick out some of the key themes that come out of these different classrooms in the book. So the first one is this college of choice, and there's a choice that runs right throughout this section. It's between, really there's two choices. You can either choose wisdom, or you can choose folly and wickedness, and it's personified into two women. And there's the choice to be made. You're following either Lady Wisdom, as she's called, or Dame Folly. And you'll go down one of two paths, depending on what choice you make. You could apply that into maybe some New Testament language. If you wanted to, you might say that those who are truly wise are those who are saved, and those who listen to foolishness or seduced by Dame Folly are those who are unsaved. Chapter 2, verse 18, our tracks lead down to death, and our guests are in the depth of hell. So, of course, there's maybe even a gospel application out of that, if that's the way you're going to run through it. And choice does run throughout it. So you can see there these next two boxes. 1 verse 10, my son, if sinners entice you. So there's the choice, if they will entice you. 2 verse 1, my son, if you will receive my words. So again, the choice to either receive them or to ignore them. Again, that gospel application. People who aren't saved, unbelievers, have a choice, but also we as Christians have a choice. We can either choose to be wise, we can choose to be foolish. And it's relevant to young Christians too at school. You could maybe bring that out of it, or maybe people just starting their journey into work and starting their career. There's going to be a lot of temptations that are faced, but there's always a choice to be made. You can either listen to wisdom, or you can succumb to the temptation of sin. And that, of course, can wreck someone's testimony, can take them, can cause a lot of problems in their life. So that's the college of choice that starts off the book. Second one I want to look at is the workshop of wisdom. So that's the two-liner section where that starts, and that's probably what we all most likely know the book of Proverbs to be. Those two-liners that start. And we're quite familiar with those. Proverbs is a wise word or a lesson for a particular occasion. They're not necessarily promises that apply in every single scenario of life. They tend to be general scenarios. But we're maybe aware of modern proverbs too. Too many cooks spoil the broth kind of thing, or many hands make light work. So sometimes they can be contradictory, but they're general sayings. They're not true in every scenario, but they're general lessons or principles that we can take away from. 10 to 15, we move away from the if. So the if at the start of the book, the choice, and now the word that comes out is but. So if you take a couple of those, 10 verse 19, when there's many words, transgression is unavoidable, but he who restrains his lips is wise. So you have the but there, but he who restrains his lips is wise. So that's a mark of wisdom, knowing what to say, how to say it, and when not to say things. And of course, in heated situations, there's real wisdom there. It's best to say little, if maybe nothing at all. Of course, if you say a lot, you can get yourself into a lot of bother. Take 12:25, anxiety in a man's heart weighs it down, but a good word makes it glad. So the power of words there, being able to draw alongside them, share encouragement is really important. Anxiousness, as we all know, weighs someone's heart down, but if you're able to just draw alongside them, offer the right word, it can lift them up. Just continuing on with that. 16, the buts change to the word better, not exclusively, but more or less, and we can apply those to give us wisdom. So verse 19, for example, in chapter 16, it's better to be humble in spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud. So of course, far better to have a little and be humble with that than to be proud and have a lot of wealth. Of course, pride comes before a fall, as the book says. Similarly, 22:1, a good name is to be more desired than great wealth. Favour is better than silver and gold. And of course, a good name, good reputation as a Christian is far better than any riches. And you maybe could bring out of that some teaching about what's my reputation at school, at work, amongst other Christians. So the third classroom is the school of the sages, and it starts with 22:17. Hear the words of the wise. So that's wisdom from other wise men, not necessarily Solomon by himself, but other wise men. And the word here is not. So you can see then that there's key words that are jumping out of these different sections, and it helps you identify and know which part that you're in. And it shows us certain things that we're not to do, and certain boundaries that are set up. And of course, it's important for everyone to have boundaries in their life. 24, verse 24, there is an example. Do not associate with a man given to anger, or go with a hot-tempered man, or you'll learn his ways and find a snare for yourself. And bring out of that about the importance of the company that you keep, staying away from negativity. So much of this is just really foundational everyday stuff. It's not necessarily even Christian teaching, if you'll understand what I'm saying by that. That's applicable to everyone. It's important the company that you keep. 23 verse 4, do not weary yourself to gain wealth, cease from your consideration of it. 1 Timothy 6:9, you could maybe bring into the New Testament there. Those who would be rich fall into temptations and snares, and of course we see that so often. If the primary goal is to be wealthy, it'll take us away from God. So it's important then to set up boundaries in your life, and that's maybe one of the things you could bring out of that if you were teaching this section about setting up boundaries in your listeners' lives. So the fourth one is the Hall of Hezekiah. I'm not going to spend too much time in this because this is where we've really looked at already today. But as I've said, those are the Proverbs of Solomon, which Hezekiah's men transcribed 200 years later. And it's really written to leaders about how to lead well and how to rule well. We've covered some of the verses already. Don't go out and argue your case. You'll be humiliated. About sharing the right word in the right circumstances. And you can start to pull a lot of these things together from different sections of the book. Important to restrain your tongue, not to lash out. Once it's out there, it can't be taken back. And of course, that's really, really relevant for leaders, those in authority. But of course, for everyone, there's key lessons for all of us to learn there. And the last classroom here is the words of Agur, and he's another wise man that appears towards the end of the book. And this is called the classroom of arithmetic. It's about grouping things together. 30 verse 24, you can read it. There are 4 things that are small in the earth. They're exceedingly wide. The ants, they're not a strong people. They prepare their food in the summer. The Shepanim are not a mighty people, but they make their houses in the rocks. The locusts have no king, yet all of them go out in ranks. The lizard you may grasp with the hands, yet it's in kings' palaces. So it's quite cryptic writing. It's maybe not just the easiest to understand what he's saying here, what he's getting at, but it's really emphasizing that God uses the small and the weak to accomplish things. You think of the lizard in king's palaces. A king's palace is quite well guarded, you would imagine, but yet a lizard's able to creep in. So God can use the humble. He can use those who are maybe not necessarily wealthy or of great standing in this world. He can use them to influence and achieve great things. And again, diligence, a good name and testimony, and hard work are far better than strength and power and wealth. So even though a lot of the book is dressed in flowery language, and it seems like he's trying to get some lofty ideals across, really at the heart of it are quite simple lessons that everyone in your audience can benefit from. And then the last one, last but not least, is maybe not necessarily a classroom, but a graduation ceremony. Quite subtle though. And at the end of the book, you have a lady quietly going about her business. She's not doing anything remarkable necessarily, but it's incredible though. At the end of the book, here you have a woman. She's a wife and she's a mother, and she's actually the personification of wisdom. And at the beginning of the book, remember that you had wisdom personified as a woman too. So this is the bookends of Proverbs. At the very beginning, you have a woman who's wise. At the very end, you have another woman who's wise as well. And at the very end is a perfect example. You might be inclined to think that because Proverbs was written by Solomon, that the final picture of wisdom might be some lofty king who is so wise and will never quite get there, like Solomon. But that's not the case as we come to the end of the book. Solomon didn't end his life very well. Actually, Kings, if you read it, paints a pretty bad picture of Solomon. He had hundreds of wives. They had diverted his heart and his mind away from God. He ended up serving idols, and God was actually displeased with him. So Solomon, even though he spoke wise sayings, he wasn't actually that wise, maybe in his life. But instead, here at the end of the book, we have this relatively obscure lady. We're not told her name, but she's the picture of wisdom. And of course, as we said, wisdom isn't just knowing wise things like Solomon. The important thing is applying your heart onto wisdom. So that's what you really want to drive through the book there, is applying your heart onto wisdom. Just as we wrap up that part on the classrooms there and the Gallery of Virtue, I think there's an encouragement there, especially for women in your congregation. If you are teaching this to the whole congregation, you can really emphasize that point, that it should be an encouragement for them. And it says the heart of her husband trusts in her, and her children rise up and bless her. And I found that as I taught this, that's a point that resonated quite well with women. Sometimes I think women feel a little bit like left out sometimes from teaching. Maybe think a lot of it is quite focused towards men. And I remember years and years ago, a girl, probably familiar to quite a number here, I'll not say her name, but she thought like the way the Bible was taught to her, she sort of felt like the main role of a woman was to bake buns, and that was about it. So there was nothing more that she could give there. But in essence, though, the real person who is wise here at the end of it is a lady who is someone who is just following God's word day after day after day. So that's something you might want to draw about at the end of your message and the end of your teaching on the book, is that wisdom is personified in a lady. It's not necessarily some wise king sitting in the palace somewhere writing wise sayings. It's everyday life. It's the nitty gritty of everyday life. So it says she opens her mouth in wisdom, the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. So it might not necessarily, not everyone in your congregation might necessarily be a mother or a wife, but it'll apply to every woman there too. She's not a gossiper, not a slanderer, but someone who is kind. And we had that in 1 Timothy 3 as well, it is speaking about elders' wives, but about that. It's important, I think, for ladies as well. So really the point that we're trying to drive home is that wisdom isn't some lofty grand ideal that you can never reach, but it's found in the events of everyday life. It's applicable to both men and women and everyone in your congregation. And if you fit in with the picture that's in Proverbs 31, you're meeting the qualifications of a wise person in God's eyes. So it's not necessarily a very hard thing to do. It's achievable for everyone to do. So that's something that you want to bring out of it. So just as we conclude, it's not just a collection of random sayings. Sometimes as you read through Proverbs, you kind of think this is all just a random muddle of different sayings, and there's not really any structure here. I don't really know where to go with the book, but if you follow, for example, that series of structured classrooms, you might then be able to guide your audience towards graduating from the book and understanding it. And you really want them to know where wisdom comes from. Of course, as I've said, fear of the Lord, that's where it derives from, that's where wisdom comes from, and then they can apply that in daily life. You want to drive home that it's obtainable, that everyone can obtain wisdom, that it's found in everyday life. And indeed, the picture at the end of the book is of a woman rather than a king. And of course, wisdom is critical to a successful Christian walk. If someone isn't wise, they're going to be foolish and they're going to make mistakes, and that's not something you ever want to be marked by. So hopefully that's been of some use for you. It might not necessarily be the first book that you pick when you come to teach anywhere or whatever the case may be, but maybe you're thinking of looking at a book to teach, and I would suggest Proverbs. There's a lot of really practical everyday stuff in that you can give to an audience, so hopefully that's been helpful for you. So any questions on that, or anything that you'd like to add to anything there that I've said?
Mr. Rubin has a question there.
Yeah, that was so helpful, Carl.
Thank you.
So many notes on that. I think you mentioned in section 2 about that they're proverbs, not promises.
Mm-hmm.
Like you mentioned about the contradictory things, and some of them are general, don't always apply, like raising up your children in discipline of the Lord. And
Yes.
like this. Like I've heard someone say about Proverbs 3:5-6 specifically, about trusting the Lord with all your heart and not your understanding.
Yeah.
Is that a proverb and not a promise? Because a lot of Christians really hold to that as like, this is a promise. If I trust in God, He's gonna sort out my life essentially. But would you like categorize that with other proverbs as like generally true, not a promise from God? You know what I mean?
I think there's certain things that I think are quite foundational, and I think that one, like I think there is a great deal of truth in that one per se, because if someone is trusting in the Lord with all their heart, I think they are going to be directed in the right way. I don't think if you say someone's trust is fully in the Lord, I don't think that they're going to necessarily go down the wrong path. So maybe it goes back to that point about choices at the start. If someone's trusting in the Lord, they're not going to be trusting in themselves or in anyone else. So you might think necessarily then that their paths would be directed and so on. But I think I mean there's a number of other points of it that are maybe not everyday truths, but they're sort of generalisms. But I think that one might, unless anyone has any different thoughts, I think I would probably take that one to be, applicable to everyone, as a believer.
It doesn't say that everything will work like that.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
The Lord may guide you into circumstances that seem a disaster.
Yeah. I think that's an important point. It doesn't mean that everything's going to be rosy in your life necessarily, but I think that goes back maybe to the point of fear of the Lord. Fear, you could maybe equate fear to trust to a certain degree, and if someone has the right view of God, is trusting in God, of course it's going to work together at the end. There might be some very difficult steps along the way. It doesn't mean that everything's going to be smooth sailing, but a person isn't going to fall into that, the wrong choices maybe of the first couple of chapters where they're following, Dame Folly as she's known, and the problems associated with that.
Great.
I just want to say thank you very much. You've made a lot of sense of Proverbs that I haven't heard before.
Thank you.
Particularly that big middle section where you talked about the ones that start with if, then,
Okay.
then something better than, not, boundaries. It was really helpful, thanks.
Thank you, Danny. And also as well, just to say in the Dropbox, there is another session on Proverbs from Teach the Word, I think about 5 years ago. And I think, Danny, you'd done that session. So I would encourage everyone to go into the Dropbox, which can be accessed on the WhatsApp, and you can see the presentation. I think it was from about 5 years ago. And Danny has helpfully put in some other notes. It differs a little bit from this, so you can. I'm not saying that this is the way to teach Proverbs by any means. There's a number of different ways, but you'll see some overlaps in that too. So I would look at that as well.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much. Thank you.